So today I will be examining the representation of women in Polish cinema, focusing on how female identity is shaped through changing historical, social, and visual contexts. Across the course, we watched many films, and a consistent reference that I noticed was how women are often placed within these restrictive structures that limit their agency while also reflecting these tensions around visibility, power, and overall marginalization. This was prevalent in many movies that we watched in class, such as Ida, Decalogue 8, Decalogue 6, and even the first film, How to Be Loved. And these films show that the portrayal of women in Polish cinema is deeply connected to history and power, and how women might be central to these narratives. However, their agency is often limited by social expectations, historical trauma, and the systems of control. And I specifically want to target the use of the male gaze in these films and different films along those kinds of plots. And furthermore, this highlights the ongoing tension between visibility and erasure, where women are present but not fully empowered. While reflecting on the history of Polish film and the portrayal of women, it's crucial to examine the historical structures implemented that have heavily influenced the depiction of women. When reading the novel Women in Polish Cinema, they perfectly articulated how women have been represented and the significant roles they play in this type of cinema. The author emphasizes the marginalization women face and how they are often defined in relation to their male counterparts, reinforcing these inequalities. And this is evident when they reference the myth of the Malta Polka, which is also known as the Polish mother. And the author explains how, under these occupying powers, Polish identity was very suppressed, and this resulted in the banning of languages in schools and overall the censorship of history, leaving women at home to become the custodians of language, the memory, and even preserving culture. Additionally, the author also illuminates this poem called Dopotki Polki, which depicts how Polish mothers must raise their sons to sacrifice themselves for this bigger picture and suffer like the Virgin Dolorosa and push aside personal happiness for the national cause. Furthermore, teaching Poles their roles in society and showing how in history men are always going to be seen as the heroes and the Polish mother figure is taken for granted. Additionally, they would link many roles of women to these sacred archetypes like the Virgin Mary, leaving women to be placed in these restrictive boxes because it is nearly impossible to critique these stereotypes without almost attacking the religion in the process. And overall, this just placed women on a pedestal while simultaneously emptying them of their own autonomy, which is very contradictory. However, as I navigate this glorified image of a Polish mother, I believe this film, A Lonely Woman, actively navigates and deconstructs the myth rather than reinforcing it. This film follows Irina, a struggling single mother living in poverty whose life reflects many elements of the traditional Polish mother. She's devoted to her child, she's burdened by economic hardship, and she's socially isolated. Yet, instead of portraying her as this noble or heroic, the film presents a much harsher and more realistic image of motherhood under socialism. And Irina's sacrifices are not rewarded with dignity or recognition, but instead they led to increasing desperation and emotional instability. In this scene that's going to be presented, I believe it's just a perfect opening in the film because it shows everything we need to know about her living conditions and how she is in this film. And they don't tell any of us this through like dialogue, like straightforward dialogue, but very subliminally through the camera work and the subliminal movements that the cinematography took and the director took. And just by following her getting ready and seeing her get ready for work and having her kid get ready and showing us that she doesn't have a lot. And additionally, the sound is very isolated, and this is through sounds of the train and the rooster making noises and the clinking of buckets. And this just shows that she's not from a higher class, but of a lower class. And she's also discussing with her kid this procedure of going and coming back from school and sitting still to wait for her to finish work. And this just also reinforces that through this dialogue that she does not have enough money for a sitter without specifically telling us that she does not have enough money, which I found very interesting. Overall, the shift from the novel and the film's commentary reflects a broader transformation in Polish cinema, where filmmakers began to question and critique traditional roles instead of simply reproducing them. I'll show the clip right here.
Jezus. No, Boguś. Boguszku, wstawaj, no. No, wstawaj, syneczku. No, wstawaj.
No, to chwileczkę.
Wstawaj, wstawaj. Wstawaj. Boguś, no wstawaj, widzisz, że mamusia nie ma wody. No szybciej, synku. Szybciutko, szybciutko. Chodź. No. Masz spodnie. Synku, jak będziesz szedł do szkoły, to dobrze zamknij mieszkanie. Bo jak wrócisz, to nigdzie nie wychodź. Nigdzie nie wychodź, tylko tutaj siedź i nie kręć się po podwórku. Ja muszę już iść. Pa, kochanie. No?
Może.
The representation of women in film has a long history of being shaped by systems of power that reinforce inequality, restrict autonomy, and normalize different forms of violence. In Polish cinema, it is prevalent how women are often constructed through limiting frameworks that reduce them to stereotypes, deny them control over their own bodies, and position them as objects within the male gaze. By examining films like Sexism, A Sex Mission, Rosemary's Baby, and also this article by Durius on everyday violence in the media, it becomes clear that these portrayals contribute to a broader cultural pattern where violence against women is not always explicit but deeply embedded in everyday representation. When navigating the Polish film Rosemary's Baby, it illustrates a key aspect of everyday violence, the lack of autonomy, especially in relation to women's bodies. Furthermore, depicting how violence does not always have to be powerful, but can exist through control, manipulation, and the denial of choice. In this scene that's about to be presented, Rosemary is ultimately forced in the role of Satan's mother, and this scene feels deliberately filmed through this distorted male gaze, where everyone around her insists she embraces motherhood for a child that she truly never consented to having. And although she's horrified watching another woman mishandle the baby, this pushes her to step forward and assume the role that she's been told is hers, and also reinforces the patriarchal expectation that women are destined to become mothers regardless of their own desires. And this can be shown right here.
Get away from here. Roman,
You're rocking him too fast.
sit down. Get her out of here. Put her where she belongs.
You're rocking him too fast. That's why he's crying.
Don't mind your own business.
Let Rosemary rock you. Go on, sit down with the others. Let Rosemary rock you.
Well, she's liable
Sit
to...
down with the others, Laura Louise. Rocky.
Trying to get me to be his mother.
Aren't you his mother?
Another movie that I believe provided more insight into the everyday violence women face is the film Sex Mission. This film is set in an all-female society where women hold all the power. This film is satirical by how it discusses feminism by portraying women as irrational, manipulative, and authoritarian. This movie had the perfect opportunity to show women as empowering beings. However, instead of challenging that everyday stereotype women face, they reinforce this idea that female leadership is inherently flawed and even possibly dangerous to the livelihood and integrity of society. Furthermore, suggesting that a society without men will ultimately become dystopian. And Duria's article on the everyday violence women face show how the normalization and monetization of stereotypes, gender violence, and sexualization within the media causes severe marginalization that confines women to these narrow, restrictive, and repetitive roles that hurt their identities and reinforce this patriarchal expectation. Ultimately, these stereotypes act as a form of violence, reducing women's experiences and also limits how an audience can understand and envision female identity. The portrayal of women in World War II cinema, particularly within Polish film, reveals a persistent tension between visibility and marginalization, where female characters are present in wartime narratives, yet they're often denied full agency and historical recognition. From this article, the author explores the experience of women during World War II and how their lived traumas are often minimized or even erased in Polish cinema, despite their active participation and being deeply affected by the war. And this is a dynamic is clearly illustrated in the film Canal, which is a film centered on the final days of the Warsaw Uprising. While the film follows a group of resistance fighters trapped in the city's sewers, it features a female character, Hanalika, who becomes crucial in the understanding of how Polish films represented gender in war. Upon research, the director was found to be critiqued for reducing women to passive, sacrificial figures within his films, further reinforcing the traditional gender roles that align women with suffering and purity rather than strength, autonomy, and overall just being perceived as a hero. However, Hanalika does have some positive remarks on how she does demonstrate moments of autonomy and participation that challenge these restrictions imposed on female characters in early war cinema, which is a really nice contrast to, as we discussed earlier, with the Polish mother. In the scene that I'm about to present, I really thought it was very interesting how Daisy's character, who is initially who is a guide portrayed as both strong and compassionate, abandons her duty to keep the wounded officer, Jacek, alive and chooses to stay with him, a man that she loves, until he dies. What frustrated me was how the film frames her through a male gaze. She looks like a model with like a very skimpy top, glowing skin. Her hair is perfectly styled and no dirt and sweat. And she almost looks like a doll, which is very interesting since that she's stuck in a sewer. Meanwhile, Jacek is shown realistically as he's very sweaty, disheveled, and visibly suffering. The scene also feels very harmful because Daisy's choice reinforces this traditional gender expectation, because instead of escaping or surviving on her own terms, her story becomes defined by staying with an injured man, implying that a woman's role in war is to support men and nothing more. When navigating the representation of women in Polish cinema, I began to notice something really positive on how women began to fight against these patriarchal expectations and introduce a new wave of female resistance. Women were actively pushing against these restrictive stereotypes and highlighting how these norms have influenced their development and overall outlook on life. This tension is clearly evident in Barbara Sass's film Without Love and a paper navigating how women break these traditional norms often reserved for men after 1989. In Without Love, the main character Iwa is shown to not subscribe to the stereotypes surrounding women, and she's a highly ambitious journalist working in a cutthroat newsroom dominated by men and willing to do whatever it takes to get ahead. She does not resist these masculine norms, instead she adopts them and embraces them. This is evident when she is perceived as cynical, emotionally detached, and willing to use manipulations and sexuality as a form for advancement. Furthermore, Iwa disrupts this traditional norm that women in cinema are passive, nurturing, and restricted to domestic roles. It becomes even more layered when considering the contrast between her and her mother, where Iwa represents the modern self-actualizing career woman, whereas her mother works long hours in a hospital while also caring for her granddaughter. This contrast also highlights this double burden placed on women when they were seen as they can enter the professional spaces, but they still are tied to the expectations of being a caregiver and having these emotional labors compared to their male counterparts. In this scene that I'm about to present, I loved watching this scene because you can see how Iwa is at her job trying to get her story, trying to find a story to work on. And I truly loved Dorota's acting because during the scene, she is barely speaking, but her body language is telling us a whole story. She's slouching and she's very careless and laid back in how she's just acting, with her legs very spread. And at this point, she's not really saying anything. However, I truly loved watching that part because usually women are depicted as very timid with perfect posture, and they're always cross-legged. However, Iwa could not have been any more different. Then when she's talking to her boss, he says one of the projects should only be for men, and instead of feeling dismissed, she decides to take that as a challenge and ask for the opportunity to get that paper. And watching Iwa trying to advance at any cost is very refreshing to me because she truly shows how she's breaking the stereotypes that women face and entering roles that are traditionally made for men. This topic aligns with this paper because this argument that post-1989 Polish cinema increasingly portrays women in positions of political and economic power, such as businesswomen and Polish female politicians. But often these women are framed as uncertain and unable to hold positions of authority. According to this article, women are shown breaking barriers and entering male-dominated fields, yet they are frequently depicted as cold, overly ambitious, or morally questionable, reflecting lingering patriarchal discomfort with female authority, which is very sad to see. And overall, both this film and the paper showed me that breaking stereotypes is not a straightforward process of empowerment and will often come with new forms of scrutiny and contradiction, which I'm not really surprised to see. In conclusion, Polish cinema reveals a complex and evolving portrayal of women shaped by history, power, and the overall deeply rooted societal expectations. While earlier, this films often restricted women to roles of sacrifice, silence, and marginalization through objects of, for example, the male gaze, later works began to challenge and deconstruct these limitations. However, even as women continue to climb and gain visibility and enter spaces of power, their autonomy remains constrained by lingering patriarchal structures that we still see to this day. Ultimately, these forms of media highlight not only the persistence of gender inequality, but also the ongoing struggle for women to redefine their identities beyond the roles historically imposed upon them. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you again for this amazing course. Bye!